OCD stands for Obsessive Compulsive Disorder. Thoughts are obsessive. Actions are compulsive. And I am going to give some examples of mine in various situations and circumstances. When I was young, around, a teenager, is when I first started to have my OCD behaviors. And when they started to trigger, they were really, really bad. At the time, I didn't know what OCD was. There was no compartment in my mind, no explanation. I just had these things I did that I was rather embarrassed about it when I had to explain them to other people, but I couldn't explain why I did them logically. And even today, they still plague me from time to time. There's this old child playground song. Step on a crack, fall and break your back. It's cute to sing, but for someone developing OCD behaviors, it was a recipe to follow for developing issues. Step on a crack meant something tragic will happen to you. So even today, I try to time my steps to avoid stepping on cracks in the sidewalk when I'm walking in a straight line over areas with lots of cracks or seams like the concrete in sidewalks. I try to make it sort of a game. It's a little entertaining, but the truth is it's OCD. And if I step on a crack, I instantly feel I have committed some minor universal error. I'm not sure if a vivid imagination is required for OCD, or OCD just makes you be much more very imaginative. But after reading too many fantasy books of people stepping through arches and rings and under bridges, and anything that could serve as a doorway, even slightly, triggered this need to avoid it. If I'm driving a car, I just have to accept the fact that I'm leaving my reality behind and there's nothing I can do about it as I pass various locations. But if I'm walking and I can avoid such a place to get where I'm going, I will, with a certain degree of reasonableness. And if I do pass through something by accident, I will turn around and I will go back through. Sometimes I'll talk to myself out loud about, not being able to make up my mind which way I should be going to provide some excuse to anyone that might be watching me. For various reasons, I would always wear this big, heavy winter coat growing up. Everywhere I went, I was wearing this coat. Even in the blazing heat of summer, I had lots of rational reasons. People with overzealous air conditioning, I like to have a spare coat. I even, for those of you who are familiar with Peanuts comics, sort of said, Linus has his blanket, I have my coat. But the truth is, the coat served as having a whole lot of pockets for my OCD. And that OCD behavior was picking up things, particularly rocks. Whenever I saw a bright shiny rock, it was like the rock was calling to me, like it was magical or special. It had to be collected. That rock was right there, placed by the universe itself for it to be picked up by me. And if this didn't happen, it was a crime against all of nature. And the whole world would end. No joke. I felt this badly. I remember my father having to drag me away sometimes because I was holding up the family. My excuse was, these rocks were going to go into my collection of my rock polisher. My rock polisher, which after 20 years still lies unused along with many of the rocks. Naturally, I had pockets loaded with rocks. However, many of them got dumped later because the compulsive feeling that they were special was gone. And once that was gone, well, then they were just rocks, and I didn't have to hold on to them anymore. When this behavior extended to picking up things like cigarette butts, something that's just gross. Even to me, I knew it was gross when I was doing it. I still think it's gross. But at that point, both me and my parents realized there was something wrong here and tried to get me help. because I had moved from really weird to irrationally crazy. These behaviors aren't confined to reality either. If I recorded all my behavior while playing World of Warcraft, you would see me doing somewhat of the same thing. I would go around certain areas when it was easier to go right through it. I would pick up every single piece of loot I could, because even if it was useless, I still had to be tidy like that. But most of all, it was the portals. If I went the wrong way or through the wrong portal, I would have to turn around my character and run back through the portal, or turn in the other direction. It was... I felt the weird compulsive behavior. I'm still rather fond of it. For those of you who look at my email address, that number is the number 4. 4 was the number of times I had to go back, to touch things, to spin in place, whatever. My reason for number 4, why was this such a special number? 3 is the magic number. 3 wishes, 3 musketeers, etc. 5 was in the middle of the numerical sequence, so 4 stood between them both. Also, 4 times 3 is 12, another special and important number. Also, 3 plus 4 was 7, a very important number. So, I had this strong feelings with the number 4. So what is it about OCD that drives people like me to perform all these seemingly pointless activities? To simply say a person feels compelled, it doesn't really provide information for someone who doesn't have these issues to be able to understand or relate to some other circumstance in their life. So, this next little bit, I'll be talking about something that'll hopefully shed some enlightenment. OCD is merciless on one's thoughts. Most people, from what I understand, have all experienced listening to a song and then they found themselves humming it for the rest of the day. Thoughts that arise from OCD are very similar to this. However, unlike just a song, this thought could be just about anything. And like the song, you feel you should have finished it long ago, but your mind just won't discard it. The thought won't just go away, it won't stop intruding. There are times I've sank to my knees in mental agony, begging for the thoughts to go away, only to have whatever sadist is in my mind to continue to keep the rerun going. There's one type of OCD that I like to call emotive encoding failure. Whether or not that's really a word or a term, I don't know. Memory is more than just a thought. Memory research has shown that the emotional state of the person contributes to how the thought is created. For example, you have a pair of twins and they see a large dog run up to them for the very first time. The first is delighted, such a wonderful dog, this slobbery, fun thing that licks my face. The other is terrified, seeing this extremely large animal with incredibly sharp teeth that looks so big. Both have an almost identical experience, but the emotional content of that memory is very different, which leads to these two different memories. One of the issues I have with OCD involves checking all the locks, turning off the power, the heater, unplugging all the appliances. This behavior isn't strictly OCD, a little paranoid perhaps, but from what I understand, a great number of people experience this every so often. The problem is, despite forming the memory that I did all the things, that I checked all the locks, that I made sure all the power was off, I don't encode the emotional aspect of the memory. So instead of feeling safe and secure, I'm not. Which leads me to doubt my memory, that I did check everything. So I have to do it again, and again, and again and again. Then I start developing rituals to try to enforce the emotional encoding process. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And then I miss my bus and I get angry and I have to go back to my apartment and cry feeling helpless and frustrated and exhausted. There have been times I have been on the bus and I have had my emotional insecurity go off obsessively and I have to get off the bus and walk back. Yes, in the snow. I've been lucky, I think. Rarely do I miss something I need to get to because of these issues. But it has happened. At its worst, what happens to me is the stress will build and build and build until it triggers my depression, which is, at which point I don't care if my apartment burns to the ground or is robbed or things are out of place. OCD just loses the battle because I just don't care anymore. It loses its hold on me and I can go on about my life. Only now I'm depressed instead of anxious. On the other side, OCD can repeatedly cycle through emotions too. Some of my most depressive dips were compounded by the fact that my OCD continued to cycle my depressive emotions. One example I can think of is I was sitting in class, feeling depressive wave after wave come over me. One of those sure signs that I was headed for another unscheduled crash. I kept trying to talk myself out of it. I was in class. Having depression disconnect me from class was not going to be good. However, the feeling of depression made me feel more depressed, which made me continue to cycle that depression. The depressive waves would not stop until it had driven me into the ground. And by the end of the class period, I was in tears. I felt very lucky that I managed to get home before I fell to pieces. And then, to add insult to injury, the OCD not only compounds the acceleration of the depression, but then it keeps you depressed by continuing to apply the pressure. It's almost impossible to drag yourself up from what pulled you down in the first place when it's still pulling. OCD's tendency to feed back into itself also affects actions. For me, an example of this action compulsion would be my need to continue to pick at myself, picking my nose, biting my fingernails, scratching at wounds. One of the most visible examples I have was when I was living in Barcelona, Spain. I was 15, 16 years old. It was there in Spain that some of my OCD-like behaviors went completely through the roof. One of which was picking at my feet. Every hard bump on my foot had to be rubbed down. Every flake of skin had to be peeled away. The worst was my big toenail on my my left side. I would continue to clip and pick at that particular toenail. Every single clip and shave and cut just made another imperfection, so I had to continue to clip and shave, and eventually I had essentially removed the entire toenail. Whether you're fighting to resist or surrendering to the lash of the slave driver in your mind, OCD drains your mental and physical energy. I think part of this drain comes from its capacity to complicate any thought, emotion, or action. Moving from one thought to the next requires serious effort. The first example that comes to my mind would be those scenes in movies where guys struck stupid by the sight of something really interesting coming toward them. Meanwhile, someone else is trying to get their attention, and they have to pull their mind away. Imagine doing that on an almost daily basis for half the things you think of. Emotions are like going on a roller coaster. It's fun, exhilarating. The adrenaline gets you pumping from excitement or fear, or you just get very sick. Imagine someone is waiting for you after the ride. The moment you get off, they tell you that if you can enter a state of dead calm in 10 seconds, they'll give you $1,000. Now list off everything in your mind you would have to regulate during those 10 seconds to reach that state of calm. Stop your rapid breathing, perspiring, shaking, regain your sense of balance, control your stomach, and more. Recently in college, I was taking an abnormal psychology class. The instructor was discussing OCD. She mentioned a variation of OCD I had never heard of before. It was called morbid OCD. Now recall that OCD stands for obsessive thoughts and compulsive actions. Morbid OCD deals with very dark, illogical, and seemingly unrelated thoughts that just fall into my mind for no reason at all. And to feel the compulsion, the need to act to carry them out. Morbid OCD is where your mind, out of the blue, conjures up thoughts that most of society would say belong in the realm of the serial killer, sociopath, or some slasher horror film. An example from my life would be, I was at a church meeting. My father was there. A lot of other people that I had known for a very long time who I had come to care and respect for. And for no reason at all, I see this image like some other reality. Everybody's dead. The room is soaked in blood. Body parts are everywhere. I see myself standing there covered in gore with this crazed look in my eyes holding some kind of bladed whip. And I'm like, where did this come from? I hadn't ever seen that. So, what happens? What do I do when something like that comes into my mind? I sink into my chair, put my hands in my face, and desperately try to push the thoughts out. Another example is me driving the car. If I become stressed while I'm driving, I get these compulsions to drive off the edge of a cliff, or swerve into oncoming traffic, or while sticking my head out the window, laughing my head off. Have I ever done this? No, of course not. It's not likely I'd survive that. But I know what an OCD compulsion feels like, and it matches. This isn't some impulse of devil-may-care abandonment that you see in movies, driving down the country road, having a good old time. This is me actually checking my actions to stop myself from doing it. The very fact that I need to restrain myself in this way makes me a nervous driver sometimes. Not that I want anyone else to be nervous, knowing that I'm on the road. I don't have a car anymore right now. It is thoughts like this and others I just won't ever say live on camera that left me wondering for a very long time if I wasn't inherently evil in some way. After all, our thoughts are the most private parts of ourselves. It's bad enough when your mind comes up with something horrible, terrible, evil, but then you have to fight the compulsion to do them. You have to stop yourself. It does terrible things to your self-esteem. Of course, nobody wants to talk about this when it happens. Nobody wants to volunteer the information that would lead a priest to think you're possessed, a psychologist to believe you belong in a straitjacket in an asylum, or doped up to your eyeballs in antipsychotics. Your family to think you want them dead, your children to be afraid that some part of you wants to hurt them, your parents to be tormented by your torment and wonder what they did wrong and caused their child to experience this. I mean, someone would have to be just a little crazy to stand up in front of the world on social media and admit that they have a problem like this. Morbid humor aside though, pun intended, these thoughts did go through my mind. Occasionally when I was a teenager, I did mention things along this line, but the reaction I got from people was very swift, very strong, both out of concern and out of fear. I simply learned to keep my mouth shut and suffer through it. To keep telling myself I wasn't a bad person, that inside I didn't have the spirit or the mind of a serial sadist, and lived in fear that one day I wouldn't be strong enough to stop a compulsion when it occurred and actually do something horrific. This psychological issue gave me an excellent motivation to want to isolate myself as much as possible, which of course only reinforced other deficiencies in areas that made other problems worse. So, going back to the beginning, when I heard about this in my class, I went home and looked it up on Google, where people had given some of their experiences. And right there I broke down and sobbed. For 30-some years, I had this unspoken anxiety about my core self. And then to discover that these thoughts weren't some obscure part of me, but just some other crossed wire problem that I had, gave me indescribable relief. That's not to say the problem just went away due to discovery, but for me, I have discovered that I have gotten some relief from OCD issues when I can properly classify the problem. Instead of OCD being just given free range, roaming in my mind, where I don't know what to do with it or where it's coming from, the difference between trying to chase down an animal when it's in a fenced-in area or an open field. The animal will still run, but at least with the fence you can pin it in.